Hello and welcome to this special edition of the School Safety News Podcast. I'm Amanda Klinger.
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger.
And we're with the Educators School Safety Network. We're a national nonprofit organization, and we provide school safety training and resources and technical assistance to schools. And we normally do this podcast as a way to keep people up to date on the news that's happening in school safety. But today we're doing this special edition because of a frankly really troubling story that's been making the news, and we want to make sure that we get some information out to you all about it.
Yeah, normally we're together when we do these, but we really felt compelled to respond in a timely manner to something that's been troubling to us for a long time, but we've never really seen it rise to this level.
And this is really this bad before.
Yeah, and this is talking about the situation that occurred or was revealed yesterday through the Indiana State Teachers Association about an active shooter drill that occurred in a school where teachers, as part of the training for active shooter, were told to kneel against the wall, to line up against the wall, and they were shot in the back execution style. That's not my word, that's the word that was used. They were shot execution style with an airsoft gun at close range, resulting in some minor injuries, which is not really our biggest problem with the whole thing. It's probably the emotional and psychological trauma that we're more interested in than the bruise or the broken welts, although that in and of itself is quite troubling. So we want to respond to this notion and this discussion that has sort of ignited around this, that, this is what we do for active shooter training. So we wanted to take just a couple of minutes to really kind of unpack this a little bit and maybe provide some perspective as you have these discussions and your reactions to it as you read about it. So I guess I'll kind of start with one of my gravest concerns is the idea that you have teachers coming into active shooter training, I don't care who they are or what the training is, with a certain amount of anxiety and a certain amount of fear about it, because it is a very troubling, emotionally laden, upsetting sort of topic. My concern is that really this training centered around taking the thing that these teachers most fear, which is an active shooter event, and forcing them to live it. And so we are going to not teach you what to do to prevent it or not teach you how to respond, but we are going to subject you to the feeling of being executed in a school. So you're going to take your personal nightmare and we're going to bring it to life. And I guess that's probably my most troubling response.
Yeah, I think it's really important to say from the outset that there is no possible scenario under which a trauma like this is necessary. I can guarantee.
And no scenario where it even works or is even helpful or is even beneficial.
Well, right. But I've seen a lot of people saying, well, it's 2019. This is the world we live in. Unfortunately, this is how it has to be. And it doesn't. And I can tell you with a great deal of certainty because we do training in school safety every day. And not once have we ever had to do anything to scare teachers, let alone do a mock execution.
And that's one of the troubling things. Are we really saying that we need to scare teachers straight and we need to they are already scared. We are already aware as educators that this sort of horror can happen in our schools. And to subject people to it in the name of supposedly preparing them is really, a malpractice and abuse, that we're going to take these individuals and we're going to force them into these situations. And I understand, because I read the comment sections in some of these of, oh, it couldn't have hurt that bad, and oh, it was just. But think about what you're asking these folks to endure and what they were asked to do with no warning. It's not that, it's not like we're going to train you to use a taser, so therefore you have to be tased and know what it feels like. They had no idea this was happening. They were told not to tell anyone.
And more importantly, so say someone wasn't really injured and they weren't really traumatized. To what end? That is not even an effective or impactful way to do this training. It's just, it boggles the mind. So I think, we're, to a large extent, I think maybe we're, sort of saying some obvious points that this is not necessary. So maybe you can say instead, talk about how we can do a training like this, how we can provide school safety training and empower people and impart skills and capabilities in a way that is totally unlike this.
Well, I would like to continue with my righteous outrage because I have a lot of it. And I think anyone
Maybe
that's feeling
pause
that
just for
is,
a little bit and talk about what we can actually do.
I'm just saying, I feel like any educator out there who's feeling that, you have the right to feel that outrage
Yeah,
and to feel that.
absolutely.
So let's not subjugate that too much. But for our purposes today, yes, we need to move beyond just the outrage to what could we have done differently and what are some of the troubling questions associated with this. So one of them, and this speaks to that, I think is an important one, is it doesn't have to rise to the level of being shot execution style as part of a drill for it to be an ineffective training. We talk with a lot of folks who do where there are drills and exercises and trainings that are highly ineffective because they are centered around the notion of intimidation rather than on the notion of empowerment.
These are the
So
ones about firing blanks.
yes, we're going to fire blanks, we're going to rattle the doors, we're going to shout at you, we're going to do all of these things, which is not necessarily in any way allowing people to apply the concepts that they've learned, because in most of these, they haven't learned anything. They're just being given the opportunity to be intimidated and to be made, to be fearful and to understand what that feels like. We already understand what that feels like. So the sort of training that we recommend really is centered around the notion of what are the tools in the toolbox? What capabilities do I have and can I develop? And how do I apply those? Under what conditions and under what situations? And how do I build my capacity, my professional practice, my personal capabilities to be able to respond to all sorts of violence, not just an active shooter? And so we have to, it really comes to the philosophy of we believe in building people up and developing and expanding their capabilities and their confidence. We do not believe in either breaking people down or in subjugating them or making them so fearful as a way to get them to comply. So why don't you talk a little bit about the compliance versus engagement argument, because that's kind of what this was about too.
Sure. I mean, this comes down to the notion of do this because I told you to. Be scared of this because I'm going to mock execute you. And educators don't respond well to compliance. They don't need to be scared straight on this issue. We need to talk with folks of why. Why is there the tool in the toolbox of being able to rapidly evacuate? Why do we have the response procedures that we have? And if, frankly, we don't have a good rationale for our response procedures, then we need to rethink them. But there are a lot of procedures and there are a lot of best practices that have an incredible amount of research behind them, or they make sense, or we've thought them through. And we need to make sure that we communicate those to people. And I'd like to add to that, we've been focusing a lot about response and active shooter response, but we need to have training for folks about prevention. When we do a training for teachers, it is not a half day of training only on active shooter response. That is a disservice to teachers, and it is not the highest and best use of their time. When we do a school safety training for folks, we spend a lot of time talking about prevention. We spend a lot of time talking about other hazards and the risks that they're more likely to face. And then we spend a brief amount of time saying, here are the tools at your disposal if you do have that worst case scenario, statistically unlikely active shooter event.
And
And so I
building that overall capacity makes all of those tools more effective.
Mhm. Yeah.
Let's talk about the inverted pyramid for a minute. I think if you think of school safety training as an inverted pyramid, and we start at the top with this broad base of what are the kinds of things we're going to face, what can we do to prevent violence, what are the potential vulnerabilities, what are some of the threats that are not just active shooter, but much more likely, statistically likely things, medical events, a non-custodial parent, an angry, abusive student. I mean, we pick all of those things that are much more likely to happen. And then we start moving down through this inverted pyramid, adding in those skills and capabilities that go beyond just identifying these potential things, then figuring out how do we prevent them, then figuring out how do we respond to them. And way, 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 way at the bottom of this tiny, tiny, tiny point of this pyramid is the point where maybe potentially we need to have a 1 or 2 or 3 minute discussion about what we do in the phenomenally unlikely event that you come face to face with the shooter.
Mhm.
That's a very different orientation than we are going to spend incredible amounts of time replicating or making you feel an event that is so statistically unlikely at the expense of not providing you with the things you really are going to use, with what am I going to do with a student who goes down in a medical emergency? How am I going to respond to this severe weather event, to this parent throwing a desk around my classroom? Those things were ignored in
Yeah.
this type of training. So we have given people absolutely nothing that is their most likely go-to tool. We've not given it to them. So forget the trauma part. It is not a good use of anyone's time and training to ignore the thing you are most likely going to have to do at the expense of this thing that you are almost certainly never going to have to do.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that, these folks experienced sort of an outsized, in your face trauma. But we need to keep in mind that there is a cost to our students and there is a cost to our educators when active shooter response training takes on this outsized, exaggerated, in your face role. And having that specter looming over American education, there is a cost to our students, to our staff, to our society.
I think the big takeaway is we hear from teachers after our trainings, I know what to do. I feel better about going to my classroom. I understand that I am capable of doing these things. I feel like you gave me permission to do these things. This is what we hear. I feel like I can handle what's going to come at me in my classroom. I'm pretty sure that if we interviewed those folks that were subjected to this, they would not be able to say any of those things.
Yeah.
So it is a failed notion. And it's very tragic that we have educators, not just in Indiana, but we have educators across the United States who are being subjected to this and being deprived of the empowerment and the confidence and the capacity and the professional practice that comes with appropriate education-based training. And that's maybe the biggest tragedy of today.
Yeah. So folks can head to our website. We have a worksheet that we use to help you determine, has your school safety training to date been empowering or intimidating? You might be able to tell right off the bat with your gut feeling, but it might be a little bit more nuanced than that, and that can also help. We have tons of other free resources on our website. That's www.eschoolsafety.org. And we're encouraging folks who have been to our trainings in the past, share out your story, be an exemplar. Show to other educators that it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be traumatic. I know for sure that when we've done trainings in the past, we never shot at anyone. And I can feel pretty confident, like you said, that people leave our trainings feeling empowered, feeling like there's lots that they can do and that they learned a lot and that their focus was shifted, but that it wasn't scary. So
every educator should have that experience.
Yeah. And so I encourage folks who've been to our trainings, please share that out in social media. We'll amplify those voices because we need to be able to stand as an example to folks. It doesn't need to be this way. It doesn't need to be scary.